Realiza. Ya, buenas tardes. Entonces damos comienzo al examen de grado del estudiante Rodrigo Cifuentes para obtener el grado de Magister en Geofísica. La comisión evaluadora en esta oportunidad está formada por la investigadora externa Brianny McInnes de la Universidad Central de Washington, el doctor José Quesada de la Facultad de Ciencias Químicas de la Universidad de Concepción, el doctor Marcos Moreno de la Facultad de Ciencias Físicas y Matemáticas de nuestro departamento, y la profesora guía, la doctora Ignacia Calixto del Departamento de Geofísica de nuestra facultad. El estudiante Rodrigo Cifuentes entró al programa el año 2020, desde la corte 2020, y el título de su trabajo es Implementación de una metodología numérica para la caracterización estocástica de la fuente del tsunami provocado por el terremoto de Valdivia de 1960. ¿Cómo va a ser el procedimiento de este examen de grado? Primero, el candidato va a realizar una presentación de 30 a 40 minutos, donde debe exponer los principales, aspectos principales de su trabajo de investigación. Una vez terminado, vamos a proceder a 2 rondas de preguntas por la comisión, partiendo por la miembro de la comisión externa, los miembros de la universidad, y finalmente del departamento, y después la profesora guía. Posterior a esto, vamos a abrir preguntas a la audiencia, en el caso que tengamos el tiempo, así que vamos a evaluarlo. Y posterior a eso, la comisión completa se va a reunir en esta sala, así que le vamos a pedir a la audiencia virtual y a la presencial que abandone la sala. La comisión se reúne y delibera la calificación. La calificación tiene conceptos, puede ser sobresaliente, que es entre 6, 7 y 7, aprobada con distinción, que es 6.1, 6.6, aprobada, que es 5.6, o no aprobada. Posterior a eso, cuando la comisión delibere y decida una nota, nosotros nos volvemos a reunir, se vuelve a reunir el público y se informa, digamos, del resultado del examen de grado. Desde ahora tenemos un miembro de la comisión que es angloparlante, así que vamos a cambiar a inglés y le voy a explicar brevemente lo mismo que le expliqué a ustedes, y de ahí vamos a comenzar con la presentación en inglés. Brenny, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
What it will happen now is that Rodrigo will present, he will present his result in 30 or 40 minutes. After that, we will have 2 rounds of questions. And if we have time, we will open the question to the audience. And after that, we will get together in a private room and we will deliver and decide, the commission will deliver and decide the qualification of the exam. After that, we will inform to Rodrigo and the public the result of the deliberation. There are 4 concepts for the evaluation: outstanding, approve with distinction, approve, or rejection. So we will have to define that concept while we meet. Do you have any question? Is it clear?
It is clear. Thank you.
Thanks. So now you can start. Go ahead.
Buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por estar acá presentes. Lamentablemente esta es la última parte que me van a escuchar hablar en español por los siguientes media hora, 40 minutos. So now I'm going to switch to English. I want to welcome all and thank you all, especially my supervisor, Dr. Ignacia Calixto, and my co-supervisors, Dr. Marcos Moreno, Dr. Rodrigo, and Dr. Brianny McInnes. Today I'm going to talk about my thesis. I'm going to defend it, and it's titled Implementation of a Numerical Methodology for the Stochastic Characterization of the Valdivia 1960 9.5 moment magnitude tsunami source. is a picture of the aftermath of the Valdivia earthquake in Valdivia. Some technical issues, as always. This is a picture of some the meanders of a river near Ofki Peninsula, Ofki Isthmus. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. So this presentation may be divided into three main sections. The first one is an introduction and motivations. Then we're going to talk about the methodology that we developed and the results, and then a discussion and conclusion. And here we have a photo of the aftermath of the earthquake, the 1960 earthquake in Puerto Montt. First of all, I'm going to talk about the historical seismicity in Chile. I'm sure you all know that here in Chile, we have a very active segment, and we've all been subject to a lot of earthquakes. So I'm going to talk about a brief history of earthquakes and tsunami in Chile and how these affect us. So more than 70% of tsunamis that have happened here in the Pacific coast have been caused by strong underwater earthquakes. In Chile, we have record of Chilean earthquakes starting from the 13th century by way of Japanese records. So these records are indirect. Direct records are started from the 16th century onwards by way of the conquistadors and monks who started sending letters back to Spain in order to ask for money to rebuild their churches, buildings after earthquakes. So we have these historical accounts with which we can work for this. And there are at least 14 earthquakes with magnitudes larger than 8, starting from 1570 to 1960. And from 1960 onwards, we've added 4 more. And I'm talking about just larger than 8. If we count the moment magnitude 8, we have like 22. This figure shows the estimated rupture lengths of historical earthquakes in the Concepción Valparaíso rupture zone and in the Valdivia rupture zone. Here we can see 2 important events, the 1575 event and the 1960 event, which we are going to talk a little bit later. Motivation. Why is this a study important? Another technical issue, I'm sorry. So we're going to talk about the seismic cycle. One of the main aims of this study is to characterize rupture patterns in the seismic cycle. Yeah, so, as I said before, we have rupture length estimations from the 16th century onwards, but we would like to have rupture estimations back in time. As if we are able to better understand the past, we would be better prepared to face the future, we would be better prepared to construct communities more resilient and better prepared for hazards. So, what can we do with this? So this is an example of the rupture lengths of the seismic cycles in some places in the world. You have in Nancay, Colombia, Ecuador, Sumatra, Andaman, and here we have the cycle in the Valdivia rupture zone with the 1575 earthquake, a huge earthquake, then 2 little earthquakes, and another one that's huge, the 1960. So if we can characterize this, the dynamic of the rupture of these earthquakes, we could give prior information in order to improve our seismic hazard assessment studies. So I'm sure we've all felt at least one earthquake here living in Chile. And in this day and age, we have a lot of dense network of instruments that are continuously measuring them. But what happened earlier than that? How can we gather information and what sources of information we have with this? First of all, an earthquake deforms the surface, and we can measure the deformation in terms of uplift or subsidence. If this earthquake is strong enough to generate a tsunami, this tsunami will deposit sand and organic matter, and we can study the stratigraphy, sedimentology, and construct a history of this seismic cycle. And also, with historical accounts, we can construct how an earthquake impacted a community, a coastal community. This is an example of an earthquake that generated a tsunami and impacted Penco. So I talked about Valdivia earthquake. So the 22nd of March, May 22nd, in 1960, a huge earthquake struck the south central Chile, a 9.5 moment magnitude earthquake. This earthquake ended up approximately 33-hour-long sequence that it started the day earlier with an 8.1 moment magnitude earthquake here in Concepción. This is the biggest seismic event recorded in history, with a rupture length that started from the Gulf of Arauco to the north and ended in the Taitao Peninsula to the south, with a length of over 1,000 kilometers. The effects of this earthquake in the population is that an estimated 2.5 million people were affected, with over 2,000 casualties. Money-wise, between $500 and $700 million of 1960 money, not adjusted to inflation, was lost. This is again the same photo of the aftermath of the earthquake in Puerto Montt, and we can see how the deformation completely wrecked the railway. So why Valdivia? Why did we choose Valdivia in order to benchmark our study, our methodology? That is because Valdivia is a well-studied earthquake with a lot of models, sleep models, and we have a lot of information about it. So we have temporal distribution of the sleep. This is an animation of the first hour of the Valdivia tsunami. We also have sleep distributions obtained via inversions with seismic and geodetic data with different sources and different strategies. For example, Moreno et al. 2009 did a sleep inversion with a finite element analysis study and a realistic geometry of the slab. And also, we have other sources of information for these sleep distributions, as we can see here with the study from Fuji and Sadake 2013, in which they made this inversion with tsunami data. So we know that we want to study past tsunamis, past earthquakes, and the tsunamis that were caused by them. But how do we do that? Here I'm going to show a simplified version of the methodology. This is an overview, a simplified schematic. First, we create a big number of random sleep distributions. Then we filter those random models, using available deformation and tsunami data from the earthquake of interest. Then the models that clear all of those restrictions are analyzed, and then with this analysis, we obtain an estimation of the most probable sleep distribution in terms of the data available. So we know that we have to first start creating a number of sleep distributions. And how do we do that? First, we have to compute a random sleep model. This is done by, by computing a sleep vector S, and with the components of S, we populate a fault that is comprised by subfaults. This is done by an exponentiation of a Carolina level expansion, which in turn is a linear combination of the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of a correlation matrix C, which is defined by this. This is a little bit esoteric for now, but we have to be conscious that C is a function of the geometry of the fault that we defined. Then, with C computed, S is computed as follows, with an exponentiation of a scalar value, and this the Carolina level expansion with a random generated number, samples from a normal distribution, the eigenvalues, and the eigenvectors. And this is an example of a fault comprised by subfaults that are then populated by the components of the slip vector S. The geometry of this fault is what defines this correlation matrix C. So we have the distance between the subfaults is D strike, along strike, then the distance between subfaults along dip is D dip. Error strike is 2.5 times the length, and so on and so forth. Yes, so we know that we have to compute S, and for computing S, we know that we have to define the geometry of the fault that we are going to use in order to compute C. But how do we define this geometry? For this, we use the logic tree structure, and this is how the subfaults geometry is defined. The logic tree structure is a decision schema organized in different layers of levels that branches out into different values. So if one follows one of these paths, is going to retrieve all of the information necessary in order to define the geometry of the fault. And if one follows all of the paths, we will retrieve all of the combinations necessary to define all of the possible geometries. In this case, we use 6 levels that is the magnitude range, the northern limit of the fault, the southern limit of the fault, the rupture aspect ratio, the ratio between the long strike length and the long dip length, the distance to a trench with which we can modulate the depth of the earthquake, and the expansion truncation. We don't have to use all of the eigenvalues and eigenvectors in order to compute this random slip distribution. So the more number of eigenvalues and eigenvectors that we use, the more complex is the model, the more we deviate from a homogeneous model, but the larger is the toll to the computer. So how do we choose these value ranges? Depends on the data that we have and on the segment that we have. If we can estimate that an earthquake, given some data set, is 500 kilometers long with scaling laws and empirical relations, we can estimate magnitude ranges, rupture lengths, etc. And thusly, we can populate the value ranges. So now we know how to create models. The next step is how to filter those models. And how do we filter those models? Does the sparsity of the data matters? The order of restriction matters? What is the effect of gaps in the data? For this, we created 2 synthetic models, 2 synthetic slip models, with which we computed the vertical deformation using a 1985 solution. And with that solution, we modeled tsunami. From the deformation, we sampled 120 deformation points shown in downward and in blue downward triangles for the subsidence, and in red upwards triangles for uplift. The tsunami was sampled via the maximum value of a virtual type gauge that was used in the modeling. For the first synthetic model, we have 19 tsunami data points, and from the second one, we have 22. So now we have these maps of data, but we don't know, at least I didn't know because I didn't create these models, which is the original model. So we use these synthetic models in order to assess the capabilities and limitations of our methodology. For this, we start creating experiments. With bootstrapping, we sample the data and assess the effect of data sparsity in the solutions. We used only a section of the data, for example, just the northernmost part of the data, the central part of the data, in order to assess the effect of gaps in the data. And finally, we also shuffled the order in which we computed the numerical modeling of tsunami in order to obtain the restrictions. Finally, after all of these experiments, we arrived to a workflow that gave us these results. In blue, we have the original sleep distributions, and in red contours, we have the estimated sleep distributions. The blue line shows us the latitudinally integrated and normalized sleep values for both the synthetic model and for the estimated models. And as we can see, with some leeway and imagination, the location of the main sleep patches is resolved. However, the maximum sleep values are underestimated. For both cases, we can see that in the original, we have here a sleep patch, a sleep maximum, which is resolved a little bit further north. And here we have the main sleep patch, which is resolved a little bit north. And in the second synthetic model, we have the same story. We can resolve the location of these sleep patches, but the maximum sleep values are underestimated. So now that we know how to restrict, we know this workflow that I mentioned, now I'm going to talk about it. Finally, we arrived to this schematic representation of the algorithm. I'm not going to explain it here, as it can be quite confusing, but I want you to see that here we can divide this methodology in two parts. First part is the deformation data, the restriction process, and then with tsunami data restriction process. So first we create a random sleep model, we compute vertical deformation, and we start the restrictions. If a model clears this restriction, it continues along the way to these next restrictions, and if it doesn't, it is discarded, and we start again. So, as I said, this can be divided into two sections. First, a deformation data restriction, it can be divided into two parts. First, we have to make a little bit of pre-processing to the data. We have to divide the segment into bands, and the experiments show that 5 bands is the optimal. Then we compute the percentage of data in each band, knowing the density of data in each one of these bands, and then we compute a magnitude profile of the deformation data, an absolute magnitude profile of the deformation. Then, when we have this pre-processing, we can start the restriction. First, we check if the random models, the maximum deformation, is in front of the data maximum deformation value, which is to say that if the random model's maximum deformation is in the same band that we defined earlier as the maximum value of the deformation data, the model will pass. If it isn't, it won't, and it will be discarded. The code allows for a threshold and tolerances, so we can set that in order to give a little more leeway, so as if it doesn't mean that if it isn't in the same band or in a contiguous band, it won't pass. And then with this, we can check if deformation data points match with the random model. So point to point of the 120 points for the synthetic models, for example, we compare them with the with the matching in the deformation points in the random model, And if the values of the random deformation in the random models are within a certain range defined by a threshold, it passes. And if a number of these 120 data points passes, and this number is larger than a threshold that we defined earlier, the whole model will pass to the next deformation process. This is an example of the Valdivia dataset that we have. I'm going to delve a little bit deeper on it in further slides. So as you can see, we have divided into 5 bands, computed the density of models, computed the magnitude profiles, and so on. Then we have the tsunami data restrictions. And before that, we have to create a little bit of another preprocessing of the data. First, we have to penalize models according to the density of the data in each band. If we have a band with little to no information, that band won't have the enough resolution power to discard models that have large slip features in that band. So we can arrive to an estimation with artifacts. So we have to penalize models that have large slip features in zones without large deformation values. Once we do that, we define an order of tsunami modeling. We start modeling tsunami with areas where we have more data. And if we have 2 areas with the same amount of data, we favor the one with a higher magnitude of data. When we have defined the order of tsunami model, we model tsunami. We define virtual type gauges in each one of the points where we have tsunami data, and then we compare the maximum value of this tsunami type of this type gauge time series with the data. If it is within a certain value of tolerance, it passes. And then we continue with the next area of the tsunami modeling. And this is an example of the data that we have for the Valdivia earthquake. As you can see near Corral, we have the higher density of wave height information and the higher magnitudes of tsunami wave height. So we start with that part for the restriction process. And now that we know how to create, how to restrict, we have to analyze the models. And also the analysis can be further divided into 2 parts. First, a frequentist analysis, in which we select the most repeated branches that created the models that cleared the restrictions. And with the most frequent branch, we can estimate the most probable moment magnitude, rupture length. This is the most probable northern limits and southern limits, and the aspect ratio. And then we can compute the estimation via 2 ways. First, we can compute a 2D mode, and we can compute also a sub-fault-wise maximization of a probability density function. And experiments show that the maximization of the PDF adjusts better to the data. And this is a schematic representation of the analysis process. We have first the analysis of the logic tree branches. This is the frequentist analysis that I talked about, where we estimate the moment magnitude, rupture length, and aspect ratio. With that, we can define the geometry, the final geometry of the estimated slip distribution. And then we have to populate with the slip values this geometry that we defined, but via a maximization of a PDF or via an analysis of central tendency measures, namely we compute in a 2D mode. And finally, we arrive to a source model. This is an example of a source model estimated for the Valdivia earthquake using only categorical deformation data. This is if one zone subsided or it was uplifted after the earthquake, and no amount of uplift or subsidence. And we arrive to an acceptable solution with the slip patches located in the right places, at least. So I've talked about a lot of steps, but how these steps correlates with the evolution of the estimation. First, we create a lot of models and we create the 2D mode, and as those models are random, this mode is quite homogeneous. First, then we restrict using checking the coincidences of maximum values, and we obtain this. Then we check point-to-point matches of deformation data points to the deformation of the random models, and then we compute the same thing. We check if the maximum values of type gauges are within a certain threshold with the tsunami wave heights, and we arrive to an estimation of the most probable sleep distribution. This is just an example of one of the bootstrap experiments that were done. So now I'm going to show the results. As I said before, Valdivia was chosen because we have a lot of models to compare our results with. It could be compared with we could have used, for example, the 2010 Maui earthquake, because it also has a lot of sleep models to compare with. So it isn't as important the choice of the Valdivia 1960. It could have been another earthquake as a benchmark. And we applied the methodology that I explained earlier to the data. And this is the data that we have for the Valdivia earthquake. We have 150 deformation data points from Plafker and Savage 1970, and 103 tsunami data points from various authors and various sources, namely sedimentology measurements and historical accounts. With this data, we we applied the methodology explained before, and we obtained the next results. See, and this is the final result of the estimation of the Valdivia earthquake sleep distribution, and we compare it with the ones that were shown before: Fuji and Satake, Moreno et al. 2009, and Barrientos and Ward 1990. As we can see, the northern part of our rupture starts in the north of Gulf of Arauco, and the southern part is in the Las Huaytecas archipelago. It reaches farther north than the models that were computed via inversions from Moreno et al. And from Fuji and Satake. And these may be explained because we don't have deep sleep in the northernmost part of our rupture. Thus, the methodology may have compensated for this, reaching farther north its the estimation of the northern limit. We can resolve a main sleep patch in between 38 and 40 degrees latitude south, in line with the ones that Moreno et al., Barrientos and Ward, and Fuji and Satake found, and south, but as I stated before, the maximum sleep value is a little bit underestimated, reaching only 35 meters. South of this sleep patch, we have a homogeneous, more or less, distribution of sleep with values of around 10 meters, which are higher than the ones obtained by Barrientos and Ward and Moreno et al., but in line with the results of Fuji and Satake. The secondary sleep patch that is located, that was retrieved by Moreno et al. And Barrientos and Ward is not as prominent in our model. As you can see here, we can resolve the main sleep patch, but we cannot resolve as well the secondary patch. I'm sorry. And this is to say that the moment magnitude estimated by our model was 9.5. So we can estimate the location of the main slip features, the moment magnitude correctly, and the more or less the slip maximum values, knowing that they are a little bit underestimated. So now a discussion. First of all, the data that we have to estimate the models is crucial. The more data we have, the more power we have to resolve the slip distribution. So evenly distributed data results in models with more concentrated slip patches and larger deviations from homogeneous models. The farther we deviate from homogeneous models, the less we underestimate the maximum slip values and vice versa. Fewer data points also may lead to homogeneous models and or artifacts. As I was saying, if we have an area without a lot of data, a random model with a large slip feature in that area could perfectly comply with the data in the other areas, having, however, a large slip feature in an area without data. So we especially need to be careful of data sparsity and data gaps. Also, the choice of branch values in the logic tree structure can impact the result as we increase the ranges of values, we increase the combinations of models and the combination of geometries that we can define. But this means that the computational costs of our estimations will increase also. But if we create more combinations, we can deviate further from a homogeneous model. So there's a trade-off that with heuristics one have to define previously. And also the choice of restriction parameters can influence the result. If we choose less strict thresholds or tolerances, more models can clear the restrictions. And if more models clear the restrictions, the results are going to be more homogeneous. And the other thing that one has to be very wary is that non-seismic sources of tsunami or non-seismic sources of extra wave heights can skew our results. If one earthquake produced a landslide, which in turn produced a tsunami, this extra wave height with a non-seismic source the model will try to explain it with a seismic source. So if we have a landslide, we can have an artifact of high slip in that area that explain this extra data, this extra magnitude in tsunami data, skewing our results. And this is another drawing. This is a drawing of the cathedral in Concepción after the Darwin earthquake in 1835, the ruins of it. And my conclusions. So I like pictures, as you may know now. This is the ruins of the La Victoria Theater in Valparaíso after the 1906 earthquake. So the main conclusions is that our heterogeneous estimations are of good quality, being able to locate the main slip patches, estimate the correct moment magnitude, and but they tend to underestimate the maximum slip values. This methodology can be used for the characterization of recurrent slip patterns in a seismic cycle in a certain seismic segment if we estimate all of the earthquakes in that seismic cycle. These heterogeneous realistic slip distributions may lead to a more effective seismic hazard assessment, as we can use these results as prior information, for example, in Bayesian inversions, etc. And the advent of new technologies, more powerful CPUs, parallelization with GPUs can accelerate greatly the computational times of this methodology, which are not slow, but are large, as it is an stochastic methodology. And with this, thank you.
Okay, so now we will start with a round of questions. Brennan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So you can go ahead with your question if you want.
Yeah, I have one question to ask you about your synthetic models.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to go to the slide where you have your synthetic model results?
Mm-hmm. Me pasé.
So you explained this with how it's a good fit of getting the slip in the right location. My question for you is, how do you define what is a good fit? And hypothetically, do you have any ideas for making it better? Because there's certainly room for improvement. It's not a perfect fit.
Yes, of course, there's room for